Hi, I am proud to introduce you today to PBL expert Dr. Jenny Pieratt. Jenny is the author of the award-nominated books Keep It Real with PBL Elementary and Secondary. These books are chock full of guidance, ideas, and templates for planning and executing stellar PBL learning experiences. She's also the author of the On Your Feet Guide to Planning and Assessing PBL, which provides quick tips and reminders for essential PBL planning steps and guidance for best practices in assessing project-based learning. Jenny is the founder and president of Crafted Curriculum, an organization providing schools and teachers the support they need to implement project-based learning. Before she launched on this journey of supporting educators in their PBL journeys, Jenny was a veteran classroom teacher at the world-renowned High Tech High and a school development coach for the New Tech Network. Many educators this year have been worried that PBL cannot be done well from distance or online. Jenny is here to show us how, when we approach the PBL framework the right way, it is really one of the best, most authentic ways to approach learning from a distance. When Jenny and I speak, she often mentions that PBL is really just a framework that captures best practices in education, from instructional strategies to student engagement and assessment practices. This year, Jenny has dedicated her time to helping educators use PBL in distance and hybrid learning environments to ensure engagement and authentic learning, no matter where students are learning from. When you purchase one of Jenny's books, you'll get exclusive access to her ebook that will walk you through implementing PBL at a distance. Today, Jenny will introduce her PBL Lite framework to provide you with a practical process for implementing PBL in your distance or hybrid or in-person classroom. We'll be giving away a few copies of Jenny's books at the end of the webinar, so be sure to participate in the activities that she shares today and send your questions in the chat box, and we will choose 3 engaged participants at the end of the webinar to receive one of Jenny's books of their choosing. So stay tuned until the end so that you have a chance to win one of her books. Without further ado, I will just turn it over to Jenny to walk us through her amazing PBL process.
Thanks so much, Eliza. It's so exciting to see so many people here today and to see that you are coming from all over the world. That's always my favorite part when everybody introduces themselves and shares where they're coming from. So give me just 1 second. We're going to toggle over to a new screen. There we go. Awesome. All right, so this is going to be a fast and furious session. We have about 40 minutes planned, and then we'll leave it open for about 15 minutes on the back end for Q&A. Know that it's a highly interactive session, so I'm going to ask you to engage all throughout our time together. And as Eliza said, we'll be looking for someone who's 3 people who are highly engaged to give away some materials at the end. Because it's such a fast and furious session, I have done my best to collect all the resources in one place, and I'll try to be sure to keep including those in the chat box for you. But also know that my website that's linked here for you and social media are 2 great places where we can continue to stay in touch, and you can always access the resources through Corwin's companion site for the books as well. So as Eliza shared, PBL is my passion. Hopefully you all are finding your superhero powers again. I know that it's been a little bit of a tumultuous start to the school year, but hopefully that you are feeling inspired to try something new, and that's why you're here today. So before we get started, what I'd like to ask everyone to do is to take their fingers to the chat box right away. And as you look at these 4 postcards right here, think about which one really resonates with you and how you're feeling about project-based learning, and go ahead and put in the chat box which one feels like it's calling your name and maybe even why. Oh, and just like we are all over the map, geographically speaking, we are in terms of these postcards too. I love it. Some good diversity here. Awesome, awesome. Yes, I can feel the positive energy coming through your fingertips. And everybody always giggles and says that when I talk about PBL, my face radiates. So I can feel it coming through your fingers. This is very exciting. I love to be with my people. Awesome. Thanks so much for participating there. It's also just kind of fun to see the similarities and the ways that PBL is resonating with us all right now on this journey as well. So as we think about our time together here today, I wanted to do my best to model some best practices for you, one of which is providing a driving question and giving you some time to think about what you know and need to know. So I actually think because of our numbers being so high, we might not do a Google document. I might just ask you to take your fingers back to the chat box. But what I'd like you to do in the chat again is to think about, if our driving question is that what you see on the screen here, how might we shift our thinking and practice to adapt PBL to distance learning, or fill in the blank. If you're hybrid learning or whatever your challenges and opportunities are right now, think about what shifts might we need to make right now to our thinking and our practice. So what you want to think about is what you know already about project-based learning and what you need to know to make those shifts. So if you could just take a moment right now to the chat box and share with us what you know about that and what you need to know. Yes, I'm seeing collaboration. I know that's a toughie. I've seen a lot about collaboration. Okay, thanks so much to all of you. I'm doing my best to just kind of scan here. I'm seeing a lot related to collaboration, so I'm going to make a note to myself right now to show you a few resources at the end that will specifically address that. And then I think we might scratch the surface on many of these, obviously not all, but we'll do our best to answer those questions in the last 15 minutes if you feel like we haven't addressed them. If you feel like we can't move them over from a need to know over to the knows, then we'll do our best in the Q&A at the end. So thank you for sharing that. It's super helpful for me as a facilitator. So let's just talk quickly about the definition of project-based learning. There are a lot of definitions out there. I'm pretty sure every person, every school has a different definition. For this reason, the very first thing I always do when I'm working with a teacher or school is to really focus on calibrating. When we say PBL, are we saying the same thing? So, you know, for me, there are 4 non-negotiables to project-based learning, and that's that the work has to be grounded in standards, full stop. Secondly, that there needs to be best practices of formative assessment embedded into the project design. And those 2 things go hand in hand, standards and assessment, right? The other piece is that it needs to be authentic. And I realize that authenticity is unique to every community. But when I say authentic, I mean that it's meaningful to the kids that you're working with. So it could be something that's happening in your specific neighborhood or your community. It could be a relevant issue that's happening globally, but it does need to have some meaning for students. So when we're designing projects, teachers and I, we'll look at the standards and I'll say, why would your students care about this? Why do they need to know about this? And sometimes the answer is, well, they just need to know that that's the way the moon works. Okay, so yes, might not be an easy lift or the first place to start with the project. Sometimes it's a little bit tricky to say why they need to say it or how it relates to another issue going on in the world. So if that's the case, we just don't make that where we start designing our first project. The other non-negotiable is that it needs to embed 21st century skills. So things like oral communication, written communication, agency, and collaboration, which a lot of you seem to be interested in. So for all of these reasons, project-based learning has gained a lot of interest. For me, I started out as a founding staff member at one of the high-tech high schools 15 years ago, and it's been so interesting to support the growth and development of project-based learning in schools across the country, because I feel like it's gone from these tiny little progressive pockets to much more mainstream education and schools across the educational landscape. And I really do think it's because we as a society have acknowledged how important it is for students to be prepared for college and career, and and moving forward in terms of innovation as well. So as you can see with these non-negotiables that I've shared here, it really sets students up to be able to develop the habits and demeanors to be successful in the future, and especially in terms of innovation and moving our society forward. So I think PBL has kind of taken an interesting dip just because of COVID challenges being what it is in schools, and everyone just trying to wrap their mind around, what does just basic instruction look like. But I have seen an uptick in the last probably 6 weeks, which obviously makes my heart happy. But I also think that it's going to continue to keep ticking up, and there's a few reasons for that I want to share. One being that, in general, I think we all kind of shared this sentiment that kiddos weren't engaged in the spring. It was really tough for engagement. And project-based learning really does engage students because of that component of authenticity, because what they're being asked to learn about matters. It connects to something that's meaningful to them and their community around them. The other piece being that it provides a structure, a framework for teaching and learning. And, for people who are new to virtual learning, new to all the technology, there was just so much in the spring related to how do we just do the basics, and how do we make it all work together? Well, what PBL offers, or PBL Lite, which I'll talk about in just a moment, is a framework for how to go about teaching and learning. So I think that framework is much needed right now. And so I do anticipate that we'll continue to see some interest gain there around project-based learning. The other being that when we design a project, we always start with what I call the driving standards, which are science and social studies. And it doesn't mean that the other content areas are not important. It just means that they provide a really nice context, enduring understanding, by which all of the other standards can easily support. So those standards, science and social studies, for the most part, we didn't see much of in the spring, because there's been such a focus on catching students up on basic literacy and math skills. So I'm excited about PBL being a way for us to get back to those really engaging content areas and that really authentic context that the other content areas can support. Similarly, because there was such a focus on basic skills and being sure students had those, there wasn't a whole lot of focus on 21st century skills, which every teacher can agree that those are so important for our students. So because PBL provides a nice framework for that, I think that it's going to, again, continue to see interest rising there. For schools that were implementing project-based learning, it really felt like a pretty seamless experience to move over to fully virtual or hybrid learning because of students' comfort with technology. In PBL, technology is a very important tool for learning, in that it provides students access to information, whether they're researching or creating final products. Students are interacting a lot with technology and they're very comfortable with it. Things like a project hub, where all of the content and resources for the project exists, is all digital. So students were used to interacting with technology and getting resources and following a calendar who were doing project-based learning. So again, that transition felt pretty seamless for them to move over to distance learning. So I think that piece of technology alone is also going to be really exciting for schools to think about how can we use technology in a way that feels engaging and authentic in project design as well. When I would say, I guess before school closures in March, when I was working with schools, the number one concern I heard about project-based learning was that it was just too big and it took up too much time, or it often felt like it was in addition to all of the things that teachers were already being asked to do. And so obviously when there was so much change happened in the spring, it felt like a lot for people to continue to wrap their mind around. And so people kept approaching me as a PBL expert saying, can't we just do like a watered down version of project-based learning? Or can't we just do a fun version of it? And I really grappled with that for a solid 2 months, because I knew that it was too much to ask for people to do with all the many challenges we're facing right now. But I also knew that it couldn't wait, that it felt really important because of all of those things that I just mentioned. So after about 2 months, I came up with what I thought, okay, we could hold on to those non-negotiables, but we could also meet people where they're at, and we could think about what a modified version of project-based learning could look like and what a new framework could be that would work for these alternative settings. So I came up with PBL Lite, and there are a few things that hopefully, will make you feel a sigh of relief and kind of take a load off when I share these, and that they give teachers permission to let go of some things while also holding on to what's most important in a project. So the first being that all learning doesn't have to be collaborative. And as we could see in the chat, collaboration is really a sticking point. We're stuck there. It's hard to do it well virtually and in a hybrid setting with face masks. It's really difficult. So when we're designing in a hybrid setting or in a virtual setting, the projects don't have to be collaborative. Now, that doesn't mean that students can't still interact and provide each other with feedback, engage in discussion protocols, but the actual design of the project and the learning doesn't necessarily have to be something that's done in a group. It can be done individually. And even when we were in fully brick and mortar settings pre-COVID, I would tell teachers that all the time. It was a huge myth that everything had to be collaborative in a project. It actually doesn't. So I would say hang on to that notion of projects can be individual, and that doesn't matter what context you're in. The other being that, again, prior to school closures, when we were talking about designing projects were usually about 6 weeks. And you can see a sample calendar of a project in my books. They were very thorough. They included a lot of content areas, and they covered a lot of standards, and therefore they covered a lot of time. And so what I've really been playing around with and exploring in new project designs that are PBL Lite is that maybe it's just 2 weeks. So tied to that, maybe it's only just one content area or 2 content areas. Instead of, for elementary teachers, thinking about doing all the content areas, or for middle and high school teachers thinking about collaborating with all of your colleagues in your hallway, maybe it's just you and one other teacher working together. So they can be shorter in time and include less standards, less types of standards, I should say. So that seems to really kind of take a load off for teachers when we talk about how we can reframe our timing and how we design the project in that way. And it also feels like you don't lose the kiddos. To ask them to kind of chug through 6 weeks of something virtually can be difficult, but if we ask them to be engaged for 2 weeks really closely on something, that feels different for the user experience. And the third bullet that I have there in terms of thinking about how we can make this feel more manageable is sharing the feedback loop. So I know that providing feedback is also very challenging right now with all the many barriers that we have. And I think for a long time, teachers have felt like they had to carry all of that load on their own. And yes, they do need to carry a good amount of it, but we can also share that feedback loop. And in project-based learning, there's a lot of different opportunities to do that. So it could be through an in-depth critique where students are providing each other, kind, specific, and helpful feedback, for example. It could be that you provide students with a list of questions and they have to go seek out an adult to get feedback on their work. Or it could be that you bring in an expert to provide feedback. So there's a lot of different ways for students to still get feedback on their learning and the process of the project without it all having to come from the teacher. And I think that's always true, and regardless of the setting. But I think especially right now, to share that load will definitely feel like a big lift for teachers. And the final bullet there, when we think about this new framework for PBL Lite, is that not all learning has to happen in the context of the project. So because I mentioned previously that it might only be 1 or 2 content strands in your project, then you can still have daily lessons or mini lessons that are happening for, say, reading, writing, or math. Maybe those aren't included in the project, where historically you may have been trying to get all of those things into a project. So you can still have other work that's happening outside of the project. And I'm even seeing some pretty cool scheduling happening for teachers where they're having students work a lot on the project at home, or I've kind of coined this new term that I'm calling the synchronous sandwich, where if you're in a hybrid setting, then when you're together, you launch the project and then they go home and they're working independently, and then you come back and there's an exhibition where you're doing it together again. And that can also be done, same thing, synchronous or asynchronous. So I'm seeing some very creative things happening with scheduling to make this possible. So on the inside cover of both books, you'll see that there are 10 steps to designing a project. And because we're condensing those into a much more modified framework of PBL Lite, we'd be looking at 5 of those 10 steps. So I want to call out which 5 feel particularly important as we think about designing these projects. The first being that there is a rich context. So again, that authentic kind of just umbrella that all of the learning is going to happen under for the project. And I mentioned referring back to your driving standards of science or social studies are usually particularly helpful for that. The second step is to think about the end in mind. So if you're familiar with UBD, backwards design, this should feel very comfortable to you. This is how my whole life operates. You can ask my husband and kids, everything is backwards mapped in our family. But it's the same for PBL Lite as well. So you'd want to think about what students are ultimately going to create or produce at the end, and then scaffold back from there. And throughout that process, get very clear on what your objectives and success criteria would look like, and then obviously communicating that with the students on an ongoing basis. The third step would be to prepare to launch the project. And I think, you know, for some people, the launch feels like an afterthought. I know for me, I was very guilty of this when I was in the classroom. The launch was the last thing I thought about every time. And I think the launch is actually most important right now than it was before in terms of all of these steps. And that's because it really is kind of setting up the foundation to be sure that the project pieces are all in place for you and for students before moving forward. And that feels really important if students aren't with you all the time. So being sure that you have a digital hub in whatever platform you're using. Again, being sure that your launch is live, and that can be digitally or it can be in person, but you definitely want to be sure that the project is starting out with a live interaction with you and the students, so that you can go through all the best practices of a launch, like sharing your entry document, collecting knows and need to knows, reviewing expectations for assessment, calendar. Those things are very important right now in our current settings. And then to be sure that you're communicating with the parents. So I used to always send out an email once a week with 3 questions that parents could ask students about the project. And then I obviously would always share the project hub with them as well. And I found that the more that I communicated with parents, the less I had to communicate with them. And that also saved me a lot of time. So just kind of being an open book with all my Google Docs and keeping everything synced in the hub in one place was really helpful. The 4th step of the PBL Lite framework is, as I mentioned before, thinking about how we want to share the feedback loop, thinking about what that will look like, and how we want to communicate success criteria. And if we're using rubrics with students, just communicating what you're looking for so that they know how to be successful, right? That's assessment for learning rather than assessment of learning. And then finally, the 5th step there to the framework is thinking about how we can leverage golden opportunities. So what I consider golden opportunities are things like field work and digital exhibitions. And these are things that were always like the big golden star for teachers that they aspired to get to, but maybe never really got there, or maybe in like year 3, they finally arrived there. And I actually think these things are so much easier now than they ever were before. I mean, every teacher will say, oh my gosh, planning field trips is so much work. I have to get permission slips and a bus, and we have costs, and there's all these things that get in the way. Well, now with students at home, you already have kind of removed a lot of that tape. So you can think about having them walk outside to collect data. You can, have them think about going over and asking a neighbor a question as an end user. There's so many different ways for them to use the field around them as a way to collect data for the project that I think is really exciting right now. And then finally, the digital exhibition piece. Again, exhibitions are normally pretty overwhelming in terms of creating this huge experience in the community for people to come in and students to talk to them. And we obviously can't do that right now. But I think we're actually more connected and in front of people now more than we ever were before with technology. So there's so many different ways that students can share their work, whether it be through a Padlet or a live author event via Zoom. I list a lot of different ideas for what final exhibitions can look like, but it really does raise the bar for student work when they know that somebody's going to see their work. It makes their work feel like it matters, and it closes the full loop to feeling like it's really an authentic process, and what they're learning about is authentic to people in the real world outside of the classroom. So I really encourage you to think about how you might leverage those things that maybe previously felt like just a little much. Maybe now they feel really exciting and like a cool opportunity for you and your students. And if you would like to learn more about the PBL Light framework, I've also included the link below. And as Eliza mentioned before, if you purchase the book, you can now get access to the ebook that explains this in more depth as well. So what I'd like to do right now is to actually analyze a model. And I would love for you to take a moment, if you aren't familiar with Corwin's companion site, I thought that it would be a good exercise for us all to kind of get in there so you knew how to navigate it. You'll notice that in the book, I reference quality, definitions of quality project-based learning, and those are defined by New Tech Network, PBL Works, HQ PBL framework, kind of all the big leading minds of project-based learning. And I like to use those as a lens for looking at student work. So let me throw this link in the chat for you, but I wanted to be sure that you saw this resource and had a moment to interact with it. So here we go, it's in the chat for you. So if you could click on that link, it should take you to the teacher toolbox, and you'll see where I have the arrow there. It's pointing to these lenses for looking at student work. So you can just click any of those that I have linked there. You can pick one at random, is fine. And what I'd like you to do is, as I share this PBL Light project, I would like for you to think about what components you're seeing and not seeing from these definitions of quality as these other people have defined quality. So what we're gonna do, I'm gonna show you this on the screen, but again, I want to just kind of give you the tools so you know where to access things later. So on my blog, you will find a few models. Well, you'll find a lot of models of projects, but you'll find a few that are using this new PBL Light framework. So I wanted to be sure that you all knew where to go. So when you go to the blog, it's going to, you'll see where the arrow is pointing. It's going to offer for you to search projects either by secondary or elementary. So we're going to look at an elementary project right now. And I picked this one because even if you teach secondary, it can be modified up, I think, pretty well. So we're going to check this one out right now. And as I just walk you through the project ever so briefly, I'd like for you to have that lens up that I pointed you to just a moment ago. And again, think about what's there, what's not there, and then we'll chat in just a moment. So here we go. You can all see the new project I'm working on right there. Captivity or conservation, stay tuned. All right, here we go. Why is it that no matter how many times you have things queued up, it just never seems to go where you want it to? All right, here we go. Right? Yes, okay. So this project is called Who Is? A Story That Must Be Told. And again, I mentioned before, it was designed for upper elementary, but I've seen it modified up pretty high into secondary grades. And it is unique in that this project I designed starting out to focus on ELA, which kind of goes against my usual recommendation to start with those driving standards of science or social studies. It is a 2-week project, and during the project, students will basically be set up to go through the entire publication and production process of creating a Who Is book. So the driving question for the project is, how might we as young authors tell the story of an important figure from our community? Or how might we celebrate the story of an important figure from the community? And so we would launch in person, kind of looking at some models and talking about what makes for an effective Who Is story. Who is a story that should be told? Who's someone from the community? Kind of begin that brainstorming process. And students would have the opportunity to do a lot of research. In this case, it's not a traditional style of research because it's a person who's alive and likely in their community and not famous. They're going to need to interview. So they might be able to find clips in the newspaper, but probably not. So a big scaffolding part of this project is actually teaching students how to conduct an interview so that they can write the story later on. And then there's quite a bit of reflection built into the process. And then the benchmarks will be broken down like this. So again, starting out with the research, they would produce a graphic organizer. They would look at examples and identify success criteria together with the teacher. They would write their first draft. And then they would have an expert author joined by Zoom to share with them just how long the process of producing a book actually is, to kind of create that element of authenticity, and then so to help the students understand how important drafting is and revising and giving good feedback, or effective feedback, I should say. And from there, doing an in-depth critique. So the teacher would scaffold those skills as well for students to be able to give their peers, and then they would also seek out feedback from other adults on their writing. And then the final kind of phase of the project would be moving towards the actual production. So taking it would be almost their third draft of their writing and putting that into an actual book that could be published. And in this case, it was an ebook. So there's a lot of great apps and free platforms out there where you can actually get students to produce their book into something that could even be sold on Amazon. And I link a few of those there for you as well. And then the final part of the project is they share their learning with an authentic audience. So they hold an actual virtual author event where they get to read their favorite section of the book, answer questions from the audience, and talk about the process of what it's like to be an author with an actual published book at the end of the process. So it is 2 weeks long. There is a lot of learning and reading and writing that happens throughout this project. And it does culminate with an exhibition. So this project I also wanted to share with you because it's unique in that it was part of the Deeper Learning Network that just got a big grant to have a few of us write these projects so that teachers could actually run them in a course with students. So I've included that link there for you also. I believe it is, I'll just call it out so you don't have to search too far for it. Access a project for your students here. So if you click on that, it'll actually take you right to the course, and it has all the student-facing instructions for you. So I wrote the student-facing instructions, and then there's notes on the back end for the teacher, but you could run this as early as tomorrow, and it's free, and you can drop your students right into this platform, and it's pretty user-friendly. So that's all there for you as well if you're interested. Okay, so thinking about that quick overview of the project, I would love for you to, again, heading back to the chat box, we'll use just a visible thinking routine of what did you see, think, and wonder as you looked at that project overview and the lens that I shared with you previously. What did you see, think, wonder in terms of the PBL Light framework? Oh, thanks, Anna, you jumped right in. Oh, this makes my heart happy. Thank you. This is doable. Awesome. All right. What do you see, think, wonder as we looked at that project? Loving what I'm seeing so far. Alyssa, you have a really important question I'm just going to ask real quick, or I'm going to answer real quickly here, because I actually created this project for K1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, 7, 8. So I just shared with you kind of the middle one. For the littles, it looked obviously a ton more scaffolding, but also is more of a picture book. And they turned out really cute. So Shutterfly is awesome for that. But I guess the short or the skinny on that is you have to do a lot of reading and pre-recording, as I know you've already figured out by now. Awesome. Okay, great. So there's a few others on my website that I've designed there for you to look at. They're not as built out as this one in the Pathwright platform, but they are there for you just to kind of give you some ideas and inspiration as well. Okay. I'm going to ask everybody to grab your phone, please. We're going to do a little Mentimeter activity here. So what I'm going to ask you to do here in just a moment is you're going to go to menti.com and you're going to plug in this code, and it's going to take you to this question. And I'd like for you to think about how you might shift your thinking and practice to adapt PBL to distance learning, hybrid learning, again, fill in the blank. And please be sure that you include your name, because we have people watching to see who's participating for the free materials at the end. So let's head on over using your device. Your phone is really easiest. And let's watch these replies come in. This is always my favorite part. So again, you're going to go to menti.com, and this is the code that it's going to ask you for. You'll need to plug that code in. Okay, seeing lots of questions about the code. The code is actually the one here on the screen, 5494166. I'll put it in the chat as well. And it looks like it's working because we've got people that are populating it. And if for some reason the code's not working for you, feel free to just throw it in the chat box. Awesome. Okay, someone said that we aren't seeing my screen, so hang on, let me be sure that you have the right. Here we go. Okay, we should be good to go now. Cool, okay, so I'll just kind of scroll through these since it sounds like my screen wasn't cooperating with us. I'm seeing a lot about being open-minded, having a growth mindset for ourselves just as much as for our kiddos. Yes, that's a big paradigm shift, for sure. One that's worth the while though. Seeing a lot about shifting kind of our thinking from collaborative to individual to make it more manageable. Also seeing a lot about sharing the feedback loop. In just a moment, I'll show you where to access a blog that I actually wrote for Corwin about different ideas for how to share the feedback loop. It's also in the new ebook as well. Yeah, a lot about using technology as a tool to help you. Great. And creating something authentic for your kids. That's it. That's it right there. It's kind of reframing. Yes, we have to get through content, but how do we get through the content and create it in a way that feels meaningful, and creating or having students produce something at the end that's going to get in front of people to make them see that their learning matters and that their work can make a difference. I think that can be a really empowering experience for kids right now. So I'm so glad to see that a lot of you are feeling excited about that. Okay. We are going to do a little bit more participation here. We're going to move on over to a Padlet. So let me throw this in the chat. Where did my chat go? Here we go. Okay. All right. So what I'm going to ask you to do is, as we close out in these last couple minutes before we move over to our Q&A, I'd like for you to think about something new that you learned today. Something that you're excited about, something that's worrisome still, that's okay. You can have a lot of worries, that's okay, that's expected. And then finally, what's a stance or, like a position or a strong statement that you can make about PBL Lite, or kind of your new thinking as you leave these 45 minutes here today. And if you could just click on the comment feature, it'll allow you to just kind of use as a thread that comes underneath, so we don't cover up the prompts on here. So you'll just want to click on the comment, and then you can post the comment that way. Awesome. And you should be able to see your colleagues' responses as well. And I'm going to be sure that I come back to the worrisomes in our Q&A also. So for our last couple minutes, as you're continuing to type in your responses there, I do want to call your attention to a few resources so that you know where to go and how you can come back to things. So a few include, all right. Obviously the book is going to walk you through kind of what I would call like the 3.0 level right now. And what we just talked about is more of like the 1.0 level, but I think that 3.0 foundation is really important so that you're, again, designing with the end in mind, knowing that this is where we want to get back to, the big framework, and then how do we modify back down from there. So the book there's two different books, elementary and secondary, and inside those books, you'll find FAQs from teachers in the field, you'll find built out projects and a lot of resources called out throughout the books, pictures of actual student work from real classrooms, and more importantly, I think a layered approach to planning. So you're kind of easing your way into it. I feel pretty strongly about just kind of moving through things at a pace that feels good so that we can be really successful when we try this. And again, when you purchase the book, then you also get the new ebook for hybrid and virtual learning as well. Eliza mentioned this earlier, but we just released the On Your Feet guide to planning and assessing project-based learning. I know that assessment is always a toughie in all things, but especially project-based learning. So this On Your Feet guide is super cool. It's everyone who's seen it is like, oh my gosh, this feels manageable. Like, wow, something that's really scary and has a lot of dirty words like assessment. This feels doable. So there are a few call outs in there as well for virtual supports. So that's a great resource that I'd like to share with you all. And then finally, I'm gonna throw this Google Doc in the chat for you right now, but this is kind of my holy grail. So I know that there's no shortage of information out there for all of us right now. It actually is like TMI, I think. It's a lot. So what I've done is I've been collecting my favorite resources for virtual learning, and I've tried to curate them in a way that feels digestible. And so that's what this is. And it's a free document. You can come back to any time. And on any given day when I jump in there, there's a whole lot of anonymous animals, and it makes my heart happy to know that teachers are using these things. And they're from resources that I can vet and say that I can stand behind and that they're quality resources. So those are there for you. Be sure you bookmark that and save it. And I update it pretty frequently. So I'll remove things and add new things and try to keep it fresh and as up to date as possible right now. And then lastly, I do have e-courses that also walk you through how to build out projects that align to the books and include new modules now on PBL Lite also. So you can learn more about those on my website under e-courses. And with that, I'm at 4:15 exactly. I'm gonna move us on back over to our Q&A.
Sure, I have some questions that came through. First one, how do you explain or describe in more detail PBL with parents? You talked about it a little bit, but can you give any more information on the best way to talk about this with parents?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most important thing I would say is that it's not a one-time conversation. I think if you can be transparent with parents throughout the entire learning process, it's really helpful because this is such a new way of learning that's very foreign to parents. And so they aren't quite sure what it is. And oftentimes kids aren't coming home with textbooks and worksheets. And so if they aren't let in and don't have a window, they're gonna assume that kids just aren't learning because learning looks different. So like I shared before, I always had a project hub and there's sample project hubs linked on Corwin's companion site too to the book where you can see what that looked like. And it was just a hub and it was nothing fancy. It was just a Google Doc and it was hyperlinked with the project calendar. And that was a Google Doc. So it was always up to date. And it was, the assessments that we were going to be using, the rubrics and all the field work. And it just had everything there. And so when I would email parents every Friday with the 3 questions they could talk to their kids about the project, I would always drive them back to the project hub. So I just think as being transparent and open as you can, inviting them in to be experts is just, it's helpful rather than thinking about it as something that you talk about at open house or something you talk about at back to school. It really needs to be an ongoing conversation rather than a one-time hit.
Terrific. Thank you. Many of our students have limited resources. This came through quite often, focused on time, technology, bandwidth. How do we reach all students with PBL when students, there isn't equity for all students when it comes to the issues I just brought up?
I mean, that's a pretty big question. So I guess maybe I would ask the person who asked that question more specifically, like when you say resources, are we meaning like access to technology, or are we meaning like basic differentiation? I think I would.
Yes, probably access to technology came through quite often on the questions.
Yeah. Okay. So if your students don't have access to technology, I will tell you as a parent, I hate technology with my kids. Like, it is the most painful experience trying to help them with something on the iPad, and they're in 4th and 5th grade. So I'm a big fan of, actually, if you can remove the technology sometimes, it's better. So, and people were always surprised when we were at High Tech High, we didn't even have a 1-to-1 ratio of laptops. Like, it wasn't nearly as high tech as people assumed that it was. And what we really told people to think about is how you're defining technology. And so it could be a screwdriver and a hammer. It could be a pen and a paper. So thinking about the tools that you're using, obviously for research, it's a little bit tricky when they can't use the internet, but there are incredible resources around them. And that could just be family interviews, talking to a neighbor, going out and looking at things in the community. So I think it's just kind of a reframing of when we define technology, what we're talking about and what that could be, because it doesn't just have to be a laptop, and it doesn't have to be Wi-Fi connectivity.
Terrific, thank you. Here's a question about being things authentic. How can we keep things authentic in an online environment? And is authentic similar to the idea of being relevant to the student?
Okay, so authenticity, and again, people have a lot of operating definitions for this. For me, it's just what's meaningful to your kids and how do we make the standards meaningful to them. So that isn't the same for every child in your class. And so this is where voice and choice comes in. This is a pretty big myth related to project-based learning, in that everything is just kind of this open, loosey-goosey format because the students are the drivers of their learning. Well, that gives me a panic attack. I like structure. And so for me as a teacher, I would say, okay, we have voice and choice, and let's say in these ways. So maybe you can choose between 3 different options for a final product. Or maybe I present a really big and broad driving question, and then within that, students develop their own driving questions for what they want to learn about within that driving question. So there's definitely ways to kind of think about how we make things authentic to different students, because that's going to mean something different. It also raises a really interesting point. A lot of times teachers will say, well, can't I just use a project that was already written? And the answer is not really, because chances are what was really authentic to that one teacher and that one student is going to be different than you and your students. So yes, we could maybe modify one, but we never want to kind of plug and chug another project into another context, because that authenticity doesn't always transfer.
Do you plan everything out beforehand, or do you leave room for the students to create their own projects?
So I'm a planner and I like structure. So I plan everything ahead, but I do plan it in Google Docs so that I can move things around pretty easily. I also like to work in Google Docs, and I just use a table, usually for like my calendar, because I can hyperlink all of my lessons and resources, and then it's done for the next time. Some teachers who I've worked with in the past were more comfortable kind of taking it organically. And I would say that if you're seasoned and you've been designing projects for a long time, it's possible. It was never something I was comfortable with. And I will say, to be sure that those non-negotiables are in there, like assessment, there does need to be some consistency in what students are producing so that we can assess the same content and skills from our kids.
Terrific. Do you replace testing with a PBL? Do you replace a test or an assessment with PBL?
So best practices of assessment are embedded into a project. So each benchmark phase of the project is formatively assessed. Some teachers actually don't do a summative assessment because so much assessment is happening throughout the project. So in the example that I just shared, students are drafting their essay 2-3 times. So when it comes, time for the very end, the publication, they've already seen it and assessed it so many times. So sometimes teachers won't do a summative assessment. Other times students might be doing an oral communication presentation, and so then they need to assess during the presentation. So it kind of depends on what the final product is, but that is a non-negotiable for me, and that assessment should be embedded in the project.
Perfect. Here's another question. There's an instructor who finds gaps in student learning makes PBL difficult for them to implement. How do you close the learning gap with students to make PBL effective?
So for me, when I'm planning, again, I go backwards, I backwards map. So I think about high level, what the enduring understanding is, a driving question, the final product. Okay, how are we going to break it down into benchmarks? And then within those benchmarks, I start to think about what every day is going to look like, the scaffolding. And then within those scaffolds, I think about how I'm going to differentiate those scaffolds. So I kind of go from, I zoom out and then I zoom in. And I think that zooming in component is really important for us to talk about differentiation and closing gaps. The way that projects are often designed, they are open-ended. There are options in products, and so you can steer students in different directions. I share a few of my favorite strategies for differentiating in my books, but one of them is giving students a mild, medium, and spicy option, and being very transparent about why they're picking which one, and nudging them into mild or medium sometimes, depending on where they're at. I also use the workshop method all the way up through 10th grade. So being able to conference with students was another great time for me to be able to close gaps and to catch them before they fell too far, which is the beauty of benchmarks and why those best practices of formative assessment have to be embedded. Because I did work with some populations where kids were pretty far behind. And so that was a big lesson learned for me, was having that conferencing, doing the Uber scaffolding within the benchmarks, and having that one-on-one time with students through conferencing during workshops.
Perfect. Here's our last question. How can we build student confidence to engage with such critical thinking intense work as PBL?
Well, I think creating something that they're excited about kind of naturally does that, right? So I guess that's that authentic component to them. And I think too, every time that I did a project with my students, it was like we were all in it together, because my name was on the line just as much as theirs was when we were exhibiting something. So we were all in it together. And so I think we were able to really kind of go through this process almost collegially, even down to elementary, where it was like, okay, I've got your back, you've got my back, we can do this together. Like, this is a big task, but we can do this. And so I think creating something that they're excited about, and then knowing that you're there to support them through the process, they should feel like, and they might not get there until after that first exhibition, but after you do one, almost every teacher I worked with was terrified the first exhibition or running their first project. And then every time I'd come to work with them, then we'd project coach for the second project, and they'd say, I kind of feel like my whole year needs to be PBL now. Like, I don't know how to do it differently, because it was such an incredible experience for everyone. So sometimes I think you just got to get through the first one. And I hate that saying, trust the process, because I am such a structured person, but trust the structure, maybe trust the framework, and get through one, and then everybody will definitely be on board to do another.
Terrific. That brings us to the end. Do we want to turn it over now? Is Olivia or Eliza, are you taking over?
Yeah, I'll be taking over.
I'm going to throw in one more link to the chat too. Actually, a couple more to drive back to the collaboration resources, because that was such a big question that came up and a big worry for people. So I'll throw those in while you're talking.
Awesome. So thank you so much to Jenny, and thank you to everyone who has joined and participated today. You'll all be receiving a follow-up email within the next few days that'll include the webinar recording and your certificate of attendance. So please make sure to check your junk or spam folders if you aren't seeing them. If you'd like to purchase any of Jenny's books or the On Your Feet guide, you can find them at corwin.com, and you can use promo code webinars for a 20% discount. And of course, 3 of you will be winning some books right now. So our 3 winners will get their choice of one of Jenny's 2 books on project-based learning or the On Your Feet guide to planning and assessing project-based learning. So we've been monitoring the chat and checking out answers, and our 3 winners are Mary Hardigan Demers, Steve Rhodes, and Victoria Morales. So congratulations to the 3 of you. To claim your prizes, please email info@corwin.com and let us know which books you would like. So thank you all for joining us again today, and I think have a great rest of the day. All right. Thanks all.
Thanks for
Bye.
participating. See ya.